Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today on the impact of regulations on green product claims. Before we dig into the content, we do want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get CPE credit for attending this session. So if we go to the next slide for instructions, we will be utilizing Poll Everywhere to track participation for CPE credit. From your computer or your mobile device, you can navigate to pollev.com/KPMG 0917. Please enter your full name when prompted and keep the Poll Everywhere window open throughout the training to respond to poll questions and earn your credit. The link is also provided in the chat from Megan. For your check-in, please be sure to complete all 3 fields and then click Submit. And the check-in will remain open until the first polling question. If you have any concerns, please feel free to put them in the chat and our team can help you navigate through. KPMG is approved by NASBA to deliver CPE-worthy training. To receive credit, you must attend for the entire session, complete both the check-in and check-out in Poll Everywhere, and participate in all polling questions. Participation is tracked and failure to participate does result in denial of CPE credits. Okay, with that fun upfront introduction out of the way, let me quickly introduce myself and we'll jump into the content. My name is Blythe Chorn. I'm a managing director with KPMG US, where I lead our supply chain sustainability offering. Our work includes working with brands and clients to support supply chain decarbonization and help support measuring and tracking carbon in the supply chain, which will be a key topic of our conversation today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Christine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Blythe. My name is Christine Price, and I'm a manager in KPMG's supply chain practice, helping clients develop strategies to address all things supply chain sustainability, from multi-purpose transparency and traceability solutions to specifically Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions measurement and reductions, always with a focus on how we can approach sustainability in a way that actually drives business value as opposed to being stuck as a cost center. And if we go to the next slide, we can provide a view of how we'll spend our time together today. So we have a 5-part agenda that starts with an introduction to the policy landscape of why we're here, the policies around green product claims. Then we move into key approaches for compliance with the new legal and regulatory requirements that we introduce in that first part. In the third section, we'll go through strategic considerations for actually making commitments. Should you make a green product claim that you'll have to substantiate under these new requirements or not? Finishing out with some tangible steps on how companies can prepare for compliance, and then ending with the best part, audience Q&A. You should be able to leverage the chat feature in this Teams platform to submit your questions. You can submit questions through that chat at any time during our presentation, and we will either pause and answer or save that for the Q&A section at the end. So again, feel free to use that at any time. And then especially when we get towards the end, please do, let us know anything on your mind so that we can try to get that answered. And if we go to the next slide, our first section of today's presentation will start with why green claims are such a topic of interest right now. And if we go to the next slide, over the past 10 years or so, sustainable marketed products have been significantly growing in market share year over year. And now in turn, requirements around that sustainable marketing are growing. In many ways, the foundations for guardrails and parameters on product claims are nothing new. For example, the US FTC Green Guides were first issued in 1992 and then last updated in 2012. So the concept isn't new. Around the world, false claims about products and companies, even outside of sustainable topics specifically, have long been subject to consumer protection laws. But what we're seeing today globally is a step change in the proliferation and fortification of the legal recourse that consumers and authorities have in challenging the validity of claims with regard to sustainability. So perhaps the most prominent of these in the news headlines that many of us are seeing are what's coming out of the EU in the form of the Green Claims Directive and the EU Directive on Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition. Wordy, like any EU regulation is expected to be, but together these establish requirements to both ensure clear and accurate claims, and then also require businesses to provide data that equips consumers to make informed purchasing decisions. The EU Green Claims Directive, once finalized, will apply to any company selling into the EU market, but even outside of the EU, new protections and requirements around green product claims or increased use of existing protections, but extending those explicitly to sustainability purposes is being observed across the world. We're seeing these pop up in Canada, Brazil, Singapore, India, Australia, South Africa, individual US states, California, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, truly just to name a few. So on this slide, we've called out further descriptions of some of the biggest ones we're seeing in the headlines, but really this is a global trend. And if we go to the next slide, the legal and regulatory developments around the world that I previewed on that last slide really do have material implications for companies who are caught unprepared or found in non-compliance with the new requirements. For one example, the UK government will lay claim on as much as 10% of a company's global revenues for breaking their green claims code. And alongside these increasing requirements, we're seeing in lockstep a global uptick in class action lawsuits and environmental litigation. And this is leading to legal and reputational damage and costs for companies, even in cases where penalties aren't levied by a judge. The fact that you were opened up to this lawsuit can still lead to negative press and costs internally. But where the non-compliance is found, the risks are also real. In fact, we call out on the left-hand side of this slide, in a survey of 1,500 executives across countries and across industries, 75% said that most in their sector would be caught greenwashing if investigated, which is a real concern when we see these investigations increasing. And 60%, so still over half, said their own company is currently overstating its sustainability efforts. And this can be for a variety of reasons. It could just be a lack of internal communications on the right language to use. It's not always malicious per se or intentionally deceptive. It's about really understanding what words mean what and how they're being interpreted by the public, and then in turn how that relates back to increasing regulation that we have to be mindful of, essentially. So if we go to the next slide, we do have our first knowledge check question. A quick pause for those seeking CPE credit. Please do navigate to your Poll EV window. I saw that our team just put the link back in the chat again. And so we will give one moment to get responses in, show, again, for that CPE credit that you are actively involved here. And this is a bit of a quiz on the survey stats that I had just presented on the previous slide. And so again, we are answering in the Poll EV platform, not in the chat. The chat transcript will not be a part of the CPE credit, but it's looking like a distribution of answers, but most were listening to the specific numbers I was giving you all. That correct answer is C. 60% of executives said in a survey that their own company overstates its sustainability efforts. And with that, I think we can go back to the slides. So everything I've been introducing to kick us off here, it creates a minefield of legal risks around the issuance of public claims of sustainability with regard to your products offered or services performed. So while the extensive list of policy developments across the globe does require specific legal review within your company of where you are in scope for certain requirements, the examples of legal risks you see on this slide here reflect themes we are seeing globally. So to call out a few of the big ones, reverse onus, and that's something that's new here. So we're seeing the policy developments put the burden of proof on the company to substantiate claims rather than on a watchdog or a private claimant who is trying to raise a legal issue. So it's more proactive substantiation. Another I'll call out here is the increased complexity of definitions. So we see companies making claims about various aspects of sustainability, but key terms don't actually have legal definitions yet. So it becomes quite challenging to substantiate words while awaiting a definition of what that's even supposed to mean or what's legally established of what the public would expect or assume it means. So the word social is a key example of that. That doesn't have a legal definition yet, for anything related to social sustainability. And the third big item I want to call out here is greater scrutiny and standard of testing. So with there now being consequences for making green claims, there is anticipated to be an increase in the number of complaints, overall legal complaints, and as well as more scrutiny of the quality and veracity of claims being made. So we're seeing that the expectations are growing, and in response, the public, consumers, other watchdogs are instigating more scrutiny as well on their side, initiating legal processes. And then if we go to the next slide, we want to look at how the implications of the legal risks on my last slide extend across the organization. So companies will want to get ahead of any internal risks that may open them up to external legal risks that we just discussed. Internal risks may be related to performance. So if your sustainability compliance performance is inconsistent with your wider company goals, strategy, if your goals and targets are not actually operationally feasible or provable, that's going to open you up to those external legal risks. And governance is a key internal risk. So if there's a lack of accountability for your sustainability programs or oversight over your sustainability disclosures, that's a big gap that could open you up to those external legal risks. And that goes back to what I was saying before of, are the right functions speaking internally to make sure that a claim is accurate? That's where the governance piece comes in. So how do you address these internal risks that prevent or mitigate external risks? I think it's time to turn to talking about best practices and general approaches to support compliance. And for that, I'll hand it over to Blythe.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So let's flip to talking about key approaches that we're seeing in the market for compliance. If we go to the next slide, I think it's really important to start by talking about overall good governance. This is not dissimilar from the transformation and the evolution that many of your companies are probably going through as a result of regulated reporting, where we're seeing the shift from voluntary to regulated reporting, therefore an increased scrutiny on the disclosures that your companies are making, and the need to improve governance around those disclosures. The green product claims regulations that are emerging in the marketplace are forcing a very similar type evolution, which is that we need to move from thinking about green product claims purely in terms of the market potential of those claims and how we back them up and position them in the market, to also thinking about the governance around those claims. and the supporting data, et cetera. So what you see here is a 5-step process, or 5-step, 5-element framework that we use to talk about sustainability or ESG governance. And similarly, this applies whether we're talking about regulated reporting, or in this case, specifically about making product claims. This is about having a governance ecosystem that is thinking about, aware of what the company is doing as it relates to go-to-market claims on its products and services related to sustainability, and having an organizational structure, roles, and responsibilities defined for managing that. Defining leadership and how performance ties to incentives, and then setting up the right governance for data and tooling for data. Sometimes this means technology, but sometimes it's simply about good data governance practices, like making sure that our same data doesn't exist in multiple systems, introducing the risk of error, right, or quality issues emerging. Then we want to make sure that we have good governance around reporting, around what is actually being disclosed. And this is where, as Christine was mentioning, it may be important to start thinking about, outside of sustainability and marketing and product design, who else inside your company may need to be involved from a legal perspective, from a controllership perspective, et cetera. And then thinking about how we integrate what you want to do around product claims into ongoing risk management. And so we're starting to see more and more efforts amongst client companies to integrate management of product claims programs in the long term into internal audit and ERM, so that we not only set up the systems, but make sure that they are being used in the way that is protecting the company and managing the risks associated with product claims. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about the types of violations that we're seeing. And these are, for the most part, resulting from actual legal situations that have arisen in the market. But I think it's helpful that when we talk about green product claims and how regulations are starting to shape those, we think about all the myriad of different ways that regulations are defining what a substantiated and market acceptable green product claim is. So some examples here of where we've seen this go wrong. One is around a hidden trade-off. I think this is a really great example of not considering the full product. So in this case, an example that we have illustrating hidden trade-offs is a car brand that claimed that their product's air filtration system purified the air, but then the claims did not account for the pollution that was emitted by other components. So it's one aspect of your product, one aspect of your service is creating a positive sustainability impact, but the claim doesn't consider the product or the service as a whole. And so that was a trade-off and considered something that was confusing for consumers. Similarly, we see a lot of pushback in the market and a lot of regulation around what we could generally refer to as vagueness. And this tends to emerge often when we see companies trying to define their product in terms of sustainability and make a go-to-market claim individually. Where they're kind of defining a methodology or defining language, using language that's not widely used across the market. And we see things like, in this example, kinder to the planet. But that doesn't really have any meaning behind it, or it's not clear to consumers what that company meant when they used that language. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how we can avoid some of these, but one of the best opportunities and one of the recommendations that we generally make to clients is not to try to develop your own wording or your own methodology, but rather use widely accepted and industry standard language. Another example here is irrelevance. I think this is a great one. It really makes us kind of stop and think about what is the value that we're trying to offer to the buyer of a product or service when we're making a green claim about that product or service. The example we have here is aerosol products that are advertised as CFC free, even though CFCs have been banned since the mid 1990s. So making a claim that a product, an aerosol product, is CFC free is just saying that it's in compliance with global regulations, right? As any consumer would expect that it would be. And so really no additional value there that's being provided, nor differentiation from other aerosol products. And it's important for us to consider, especially in this ecosystem that we face right now of increased regulations, is the bar just going up generally for my industry in terms of what I deliver to my customers and my consumers, or is what I'm offering actually really differentiated and worth making a claim about? And we'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. If we keep going to the next slide, though, let's talk a little bit more about some of these common pitfalls and challenges that we see companies facing in the market as they attempt to go to market on the greenness or the sustainability attributes of their products in this more regulated environment. I think one of the areas that Christine and I spend a lot of time on is right in the middle there, number 3 and number 8, which are very closely related, either underestimating the data collection and verification complexity to really have a credible, robust claim in the market, or conversely, overestimating data availability and quality. And this is where, again, Christine and I spend a lot of our time working with companies specifically in the supply chain and helping them to gather supplier-specific data related to emissions as well as water and waste use to be able to make claims about their products and the full life cycle of their products. We're helping them to choose widely acceptable and industry accepted estimations, because it's very difficult to make claims often, or the types of claims that companies often want to make require data and substantiation beyond the 4 walls of their organization. And they are, at least to some extent, often dependent on data and information, and the ability to verify that data and information from other partners in the value chain. So I think this is a really crucial one to think about as companies are thinking about beginning to make claims or continuing to make claims as more regulation is emerging, is not only do you have the data and the availability of data internally, but can you get the data that you need to substantiate that claim across the value chain? We've also hit a little bit on governance structures. I think similarly, reporting structures and manual processes. Again, we see this as really related to what many of you are probably trying to do in response to regulated reporting. But a lot of companies continue to be challenged by very manual data collection and reporting, Excel-based spreadsheets that live on somebody's hard drive, that don't have any controls or governance around them. Managing the quality of that data year over year. And so we really encourage you to think about these go-to-market claims in relation to what your companies may be doing on regulated reporting, because there's a real opportunity here to piggyback on the data governance systems and controls that you may be putting in place for the reporting purposes. And I think the last point I want to make here is around number 9, limited or insufficient training. This is an area, again, that we see a lot of companies are trying to make really exciting strides to integrating sustainability into the responsibilities of functions across the organization. So rather than it just being a sustainability team to go gather all of this data, we see that more and more companies are partnering with procurement and sourcing or supply chain to go gather scope 3 emissions data, for example. But it's very hard for a lot of these functional leads to to know what good looks like in terms of quality, in terms of what we would expect the data to look like, because they're not ESG or sustainability experts. And so it's really about finding the right balance of, yes, pushing this into the functions and making it part of everybody's job, but also having the expertise to support them, and giving functions training to understand how to collect data, what good data quality looks like, how to support value chain partners in gathering that data, et cetera. Because it is, as we're trying to do more and more disclosure reporting, go to market claims, we are seeing more and more colleagues involved across the organization. We need to support them with training to make sure that it's done in a high quality, incredible way. So that brings us to our next poll EV question. If we flip to the next slide. Our question is, green claim requirements apply to all of the following except A, wording, B, colors, C, symbols, or D, all of the above. So please take a moment and switch screens back to pollev.com, and we'll get a view here of how the answers are coming in. And I'm excited to see, I know I did not voice over this, but it looks like people were actively reading as we were going through the content to say that the requirements and the regulations that we're seeing can apply to all of the above. So wording, which we've talked a lot about, but also colors and symbols. So there's a lot of complexity in these regulations. And again, what we're seeing is leading practices is involving a lot of different stakeholders from across your organizations to help guide appropriate claims related to sustainability. Okay, and I'll pass it back to Christine here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so a solid few of the common challenges and pitfalls that Blythe just walked us through relate to data. And I'll call out the same two that Blythe did and add a third to bring to the forefront of our minds. So we really commonly see pitfalls from underestimating the complexity of data collection and verification, and overestimating data availability and quality, alongside challenges from disorganized and duplicative data gathering processes. So we developed this view of what good looks like to really underscore those challenges, because you'll see the sheer number of data sources you may need to pull from, and that can be intimidating. And a fair amount of work is required upfront, even just to do this mapping for a specific company's real world case and real world needs. But what I do want to call out here is two things. First, an emphasis on verifiable raw data and third-party views, established standards and frameworks and proxies. We should not be creating bespoke ways to collect and manipulate data. That would be harder as well as less accepted by the green claims requirements. But there's no need to be intimidated. I want to impress upon you all how complicated it is, but not impossible. If the juice is worth the squeeze to continue to or start making green product claims, then we can break it down into a more feasible process of how you collect the necessary data. So if we go to the next slide. Underpinning all of this, a huge part of our data collection will rely on supplier engagement, but we want to break it down into a prioritized and iterative process. So first, we often work with clients to understand what data you already have, and that may be in unexpected places. So we want to really map what you've already collected versus what needs to be sourced externally still. So that's the initial questions you'll see at the top of this slide. Do you own the data? Does it need to be sourced externally? And what methodologies can you use? Meaning, what methodologies are permissible based on the regulations you are in scope for? Then we expand that initial data gathering for points you are required to source externally, but you expect to be relatively readily available. For example, it may exist in published sustainability reports that we can scrape from the web, or it would be a data point that you expect your suppliers to more or less have on hand. So that's the next step of data collection that we'll go through. Only after we've done collecting what we already have internally or can do internally, or collecting that initial data that we believe is most readily available from suppliers, do we start on this third bucket of higher effort data, such as supply chain data from upstream of your tier 1 suppliers. It's likely that you will need even this high effort data to substantiate green claims in the current regulatory environment, but taking this iterative 3-step approach creates stage gates and checkpoints for whether it's worth the level of effort and resources for you to keep going. It also allows you moments to pressure test your data collection and governance structure, and lends itself to other operational benefits. So breaking it down into 3 steps, it's a helpful way to chunk out the effort that we need to go through. And with that, I believe I will hand it back to Blake.
Yep. Before we go any further talking about data and kind of the steps to go substantiate these claims, we want to pause for a second and reflecting on Christine's comment about, is the juice worth the squeeze? I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about green claims strategically. As you can see, there is a lift associated with meeting the regulatory requirements that are emerging around green claims, particularly on the data and technology front. And some of that is going to need to be underpinned by engagement and training, both internally and with value chain partners. And so we don't want to just jump to the assumption that there's always going to be strategic value in making these claims, given the increased scrutiny and risk associated with these claims. So if we go to the next slide, the advancing, there we go. Great, thank you, team. There is certainly a lot of data in the market, much of which you all are probably familiar with, that shows that that consumers care about sustainability and that green claims resonate with them. We hear a lot about how consumers link trusting brands to sustainability performance. We hear a lot from customers in surveys that say that they look for brands that demonstrate that they have aligned values with consumers, and that consumers are more likely, up to 84% more likely, to buy from a brand that aligns with their own values. We also know that that there have been cases where brands have made green claims and defended those successfully in courts, and so we know that this can be done. But if we go to the next slide, we also want to acknowledge that there may not always be a margin uplift associated with making a sustainability claim. There's a lot of data in the market that is still inconclusive. And while we hear things from consumers like increased loyalty or brand preference, that doesn't necessarily mean a margin increase or price premium associated with a sustainable claim. Sometimes it's about capturing and retention of market share, reduced cost of customer acquisition, et cetera, which we can measure, but it's a little bit more challenging. And so we really need to understand, before we take on the risk and the burden of substantiating green claims, we really need to understand what we expect to be the upside of doing so. If we go to the next slide, where we are seeing some emerging data showing us that there is real value to be captured through the processes that are required by green claims requirements and regulations is more in B2B, interestingly enough. And I think this is because a lot of times we talk about the counterfactual of those companies who have set decarbonization and other sustainability related targets, the cost of going out and buying an offset from a credible, verifiable market versus the cost of reducing the carbon footprint or other associated environmental impacts. It makes more sense strategically to do the work to reduce the footprint and therefore to try to capture more market share and an increased premium associated with that. I think this is interesting as well when we think about B2B companies who are ultimately consumer facing. So when we think about consumer goods or apparel, et cetera, who may be selling through retail, there's almost like two customers, two consumers, right? And even if we're not necessarily going to see a direct uplift from a consumer caring about that green claim, is there opportunity, for example, for better shelf placement or an end cap placement for a product? Because there's a green claim that's made that is substantiated with credible and high quality data that allows that retailer to achieve these B2B benefits that we see emerging from an improved environmental performance. All this to say, we don't see a clear, strong market signal answer to say, yes, there is absolutely benefit from every green claim that is made in the market. But I think understanding segments, particular buyer motivations, be those consumers or other business customers, and really understanding what that uplift potential is a really crucial piece of doing work on green claims so that we know what we expect to get from all of the effort that's required to make a green claim with credibility. So if we go to the next slide, I'll pass it back to Christine to talk a little bit more about how we do so successfully.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think Blythe did a really great job introducing the idea that the answer will not always be to stay silent or to back off of green claims you've previously made. That is something that we have been seeing in the market in response to these growing regulations, but there's benefit, and it may be real net benefit to you to advertise truthfully the sustainability attributes of your products. So despite the challenges of substantiating claims in today's policy environment, you can capture the benefits of making those green product claims if you can follow these 6 best practices. The first is to use clear, accurate, and substantiated claims. The key point underpinning this is not to overstate positive impact. The second item we call out here is being specific about the scope of the claim. And this one can be harder to wrap your head around, but goes back to that car air filter example that Blythe told us about earlier. And to those of you who may have tuned in late, essentially a car company claimed that the air filtration system on the car was so effective that it actually cleaned the air it drove through. But in fact, as with all cars, pollution is still emitted from other components, such as the friction of tires on the road. So the net effect is still that the car is polluting, making this a false claim. So your claims need to be clear on whether they are about a specific component, a process, a full product, or the net of your company's entire operations. The third item we call out here is being transparent about trade-offs. So place your positive claim in the overall context of the product impact, especially if your claim is just about one component. The fourth item we call out here is using established labeling schemes and certifications. Company-specific language and imagery can be misleading or confusing, especially going back to how so many commonly used sustainability-related words don't have legal definitions. It's really best to stick to recognized labels, certifications, word choice, imagery. We also want to call out here avoiding an over-reliance on external offsets to enable your claims. So different regulations around the world will permit or prevent the use of carbon offsets in different ways, but generally you will want to focus on real gross emissions reductions rather than external offsets for any carbon or climate-related claims or other environmental topics. And the last box called out on this slide is about providing easy to access, useful information for your consumers to make their own choices, guided by what they care about the most. And so this could be through information on the packaging itself. We see companies adding QR codes that link out to more detailed information, or other creative ways to empower your consumers to understand the sustainability attributes of your products. We just want that information to be accessible and maybe layered to make the claim and then start substantiating the claim proactively in a way that consumers can dig into themselves. And if we go to the next slide, we have our third of 4 knowledge check questions. So again, those seeking CPE credit should navigate to poll EV at this time. And we have a question where I want to call out the negative in this question. Which of the following will not help reduce greenwashing? So several of these responses were on my previous slide of what are good practice to reduce your risk and reduce perceived greenwashing. One item on this list is not a best practice. And it looks like generally the audience is getting this quite accurate. Essentially, we do want to use clear, accurate, and substantiated claims, be specific about the scope of our claim, and we do want to use established third-party language certifications. What we don't want to do is rely too heavily on external offsets to achieve our claims related to being carbon neutral or net zero. And I am going to hand it back to Blythe. We've talked about general best practices, general themes, but let's get specific now. What steps can we actually take to prepare for these new requirements?
Great. Thank you, Christine. All right, let's dig in. In the near term, on the next slide, we recommend that companies start with proactive due diligence. So this is about assessing, number one, identify where your company may be making green related market claims. And I use kind of that word related to point out this could be broader than just a label on a specific product. And so we really need to look at product communications broadly, which could be about a statement in a voluntary ESG report about a product, specific product, and how sustainable, quote unquote, green it is. It could be something that somebody from the communications team posted on social media about a specific product or service and a reduced footprint associated with that. So these communications happen across lots and lots of places in an organization. It's not just about the specific label on the product, right? Especially when we're talking about services or more B2B products. So we need to think broadly and assess where those communications are happening to identify what may or may not be within the realm of the regulations. Then we need to take that pause, right, and identify what is the strategic value of continuing to make those claims. Really thinking about what is that uplift that we expect to see. How have we heard from consumers or customers that they value our product differently from others, and verify that this is really going above and beyond what is regulatorily required. Going back to that great CFC example. The next step is to substantiate. So if we've found that we are making claims about products or services in the market, there is value that the company is aligned on, is generated from doing so, and we want to continue to do so. We want to undertake the work to really assess and analyze what the requirements are telling us in terms of the data and the substantiation that we need, and go through the process of gathering that data, again, with the right controls and governance that's going to position your company to be able to respond to any questions from regulators or consumers or others in the market who might push back against that claim. And then the last step is implement. And this is really about building those, again, that governance, those controls, et cetera, and making sure that as you are rolling out these claims or continuing these claims, that you have legal and risk considerations integrated into how you continue to operate and to take these claims to market. If we go to the next slide, this is our last poll EV question, and it's a little bit of a reflection on the previous section. So dig back in your brain about 5 minutes. We wanted to make sure this is really sticking with you. What percentage of global respondents said they are more inclined to buy from a brand whose values align with their own? So please take a moment to flip over to your poll EV screen. We'll take a look at how the results are coming in. Think we managed to trick some of our participants today. The percentage is higher than you would expect. The answer is actually D. 84% of global respondents said they are more inclined to buy from a brand whose values align with their own. I do think it's important to think really carefully about the words here, right? It doesn't say that they're willing to pay more, but it does indicate that the market is looking for products, services, et cetera, brands whose values align with their own. And therefore, as companies, we have to find a way to communicate that to consumers because they are looking for it. Okay, if we go back to the slides then, we'll talk in a little bit more detail for just a few more minutes about how we recommend companies really dig in to managing green product claims in light of the new regulations. But I do want to encourage everyone to put any questions in the chat because we're quickly approaching the Q&A portion of our session. So again, when we work with clients who may already be making claims in the market related to the greenness or the sustainability of their products, we encourage them to look at the requirements that they're subject to. Christine at the outset walked you through a number of different regulations that we're seeing around the world emerging. Some companies take a very narrow view of just where are we selling our products today, where's our market share, what are the regulations in those geographies. Others take a more conservative, comprehensive view as guided by their legal teams to say, whether we're selling there or not today, maybe that we think this is indicative of how regulation is going to evolve over the next 3 to 5 years, and therefore we want to be prepared for that and take a more comprehensive view, but really make sure that you have a strong understanding internally of what the requirements are. And then similarly to what we showed on the last slide, it's about going and understanding where those gaps may be in the data that you're currently collecting, and working with your colleagues internally to mitigate any risk that is identified through that gap assessment. So this is about making sure that you are using existing and industry accepted labeling frameworks and certifications, making sure that you have the right data governance and controls in place, et cetera. So that you can continue to make these claims in the market while reducing the risk associated with the increased regulation. And then the final point I want to make today is one we've been touching on a little bit. If we go to the next slide, just to remind everyone and kind of draw some connections between other work streams that you all may be involved with. The requirements that are set forth by these green product claim regulations really push companies to doing very similar work to a lot of the other regulations around required reporting and other work that your company may be doing strategically to improve margins, reduce costs, et cetera, that are going to enable you to build from other programs and not have to build from scratch when you're trying to gather the data that's required to substantiate these claims. So for example, Christine and I are doing a lot of work right now around supply chain visibility and traceability. Some of it is driven by compliance with regulations. Some of it is driven by the need to reduce cost margins and improve efficiency in the supply chain. Understand where there might be constraints in the supply chain and be able to manage around those. But that data can enable you to do better data collection from the full value chain and move away from estimates so that you have data that really shows a differentiation of your product from others. Similarly, we see a lot of clients starting to make claims around product recyclability and repairability related to circularity. A lot of the data that's required for making those claims comes from a lot of the processes that your companies are probably doing already. Performance testing, user testing, putting warranties on products. That data can help substantiate claims that you might want to make to the market about longer lifetimes, reduced waste, etc. So I think it's just important to call out, one, rarely do we find a company who's really starting from scratch on this. And two, there may already be a lot going on internally that you can build from to enable you to start or continue making claims in the market in a way that doesn't introduce regulatory risk. So with that, we're going to go ahead and pause the content for today and start responding to questions. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. And I'm going to turn it to Christine, because I have not been watching the last couple of minutes to see if we have any questions that have come in so far.
Yeah, and thank you. I think we can bring the slide down and make this conversational. I want to create one flag that you will have to check out from PollEV to get your CPE credit. So before we shut down this webcast, we will bring back up those checkout instructions. And otherwise, yeah, definitely want to dive into Q&A now. So keep the questions coming in the chat. So one that we recently received in the chat is, when do the new regulations go into effect, and are some companies or industries excluded from reporting? So I do want to call out, starting with the latter part of that question, these aren't necessarily reporting requirements. It's not the EU CSRD Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which mandates you proactively put out an annual report. It's about proactively being able to substantiate your claims in various ways, but it's not necessarily a new reporting requirement in that sense. But we aren't seeing that certain companies or industries are excluded from the requirements. I would say the main differentiation that we are seeing is, for example, in the EU, small and micro enterprises, the EU is looking for ways to support them in substantiating their claims, not different requirements for what's needed for substantiation, but recognizing the increased burden on those companies around data collection, what programs can be put in place to help them with what they need help with. The details of that are not finalized yet, but ultimately the requirements are not differing across companies, sizes, or industries. And then working my way backwards to the first part of the question, when do the new regulations come into effect? This varies across geographies. And, you know, one point I made when I was opening up is that some of these requirements have been around a long time. You know, we already have the green guides from the FTC in the US. There's talk about them strengthening, but many of these false claims regulations are in place already. Some of the strengthened and sustainability specific ones are already in effect. Canada, their bill has passed into law this year, and compliance will go into effect in December. The EU will be finalizing soon. So the timelines are varied, but as a baseline, there are expectations that are already in place globally around your claims and your ability to substantiate them. So a lot of responses there to a multi-part question, but Randy, thank you for raising those. And then, oh, great. Glad to hear that was helpful. And then we are getting a question from Anne on what is the national or EU entity that monitors compliance on green claims. And I will again say it varies. So you asked specifically about the EU, but in each country, the regulator will vary. And Crystal helpfully added the very specific answer for the EU in the chat. So there is already a regulation in place, the ECGT. And that is giving clear directions specifically around terms that have been spelled out, better for the planet, eco-friendly. So I believe this is going back to Randy's question of when will they go into effect? And I was bringing up the EU Green Claims Directive, which is still finalizing, but we do already have the ECGT. And then Blythe, maybe I'll turn it over to you so folks can get a break from my voice, but what is the third party that approves green claims? And spoiler alert, not going to be one single answer again, but
yeah, I feel like we're sounding like consultants, Christine. It's the classic it
yes.
depends answer.
Yes.
It depends across geographies. I think that it's interesting because I go back to the question about reporting and whether companies are excluded or not and when they go into effect. The regulations that we're seeing related to green product claims feel much more like traditional corporate related regulations, right? Where there's no, for the most part, there are not reporting requirements, but there is a requirement on the company to proactively ensure that you are compliant should a claim be made against you. So should a group of consumers, another company say, well, actually, we don't believe this claim. We think it is false for these reasons. And that's why you go through all of this work to have all of this data and substantiation in place to say, actually, the claim is true and here's why. Right. And we have seen that successfully defended in courts in the US in particular that I can think of, potentially other places globally as well. But this is it's just a different type of regulation in that there's no regular reporting requirement. There's no approval process associated with most of these regulations. It's more about putting the onus on your companies to have the ability to substantiate any claim. So you, for the most part, can make claims that you want to make. It's just that the risk is increasing associated with those because there are more regulations that allow you to be challenged in courts for those claims. And you want to have the proper documentation and data to support them. I think we're about at time. We have 1 minute remaining. So I do want to, I know we haven't gotten to all of the questions in the chat, which I apologize for, but in the interest of making sure everyone who has attended receives their CPE credit, we do want to point you to the slide that's currently showing on the screen. This is your last opportunity to flip to polev.com and you will complete all 3 fields that are show up on the screen of your full name and email address, and then click submit so that your CPE credit will be accrued. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for attending today. Hopefully this was a helpful introduction and overview of what we're seeing with green product claim regulations in the market and how your companies can best prepare. Please let us know if you have any follow-on questions, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.